Madam Deputy Speaker. The famine in Gaza is clearly man-made and is abominable. The tens of thousands of civilians that have been brutally killed is abominable. The retention of the hostages by Hamas and even the retention of those who have passed away in their bodies is equally abominable. We can all see what is happening in Gaza and we can all see what is happening in the West Bank, and this cannot be allowed to continue. What more messages can we send to Netanyahu and the Israeli government to say that the two-state solution is the only way forward? It is the only way to guarantee the peace and security in the Middle East that every single innocent civilian deserves, and to stop the increased illegal settlements in the West Bank.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'd want to associate myself with the remarks of the Honourable Lady and congratulate her, I think, on her recent wedding. Can I just... She's absolutely right, because there seem to be those in the Israeli government that either want to see one state in which it's incumbent on them to be clear about how everyone in that one state has equality before the law, or they want to see no state perpetuated forever. And that we must stand against, because it's not in the interests of Israel to be safe and secure, and it's fundamentally against the interests of the Palestinian people, because the desire for two states is a just cause and one we must stand behind.
What action will His Majesty's government take if the government of Israel proceed with their plan to build in the E1 corridor?
Foreign Secretary.
I'm not going to get ahead of my skis. We continue to work with partners internationally on making those assessments. I spoke to the Israeli Foreign Minister and was very clear that we stand against this, and he will recall that the last government, when these plans surfaced, stood against the E1 development, and at that time I think the government's position was that they would recognise if they went ahead. So we will continue to make that assessment, but I hope we can see these plans put to one side.
Claire Hanna.
Last month, along with 8 party leaders across Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, I wrote to the Prime Minister about the catastrophic situation in Gaza and about the deficits in the UK response, alongside the unbearable suffering that we're seeing, biblical levels of injustice and pain and hunger. Does the Foreign Secretary recognise the parallel crisis in the belief of ordinary people across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in international law and in the UK's response? People who aren't seeing their values reflected in the UK's actions, in the continued supply of arms, in the failure to levy all possible sanctions and in the strings attached to the recognition of the State of Palestine.
Foreign Secretary.
Can I just be clear? There is a lot of mendacity in relation to some of the sort of TikTok stuff that you see. We have stopped the sale of arms to Gaza. We have stopped the direct sales of F-35s to Gaza. To Israel. Germany only just recently made a decision that we made last September. 1% of sales is what the UK represents. 90% are Germany and the US system. And there are many other governments that supply stuff that have not made the decisions that we have made. And on recognition, we will continue to work with partners as we head towards UNGA and make those necessary assessments.
Edward Morello.
The Foreign Secretary in his statement outlined all of the steps that this government has taken against the Netanyahu government. He has also repeatedly said that the UK has done everything it can. In my mind, both are tacit admittances of defeat, as we have seen the Netanyahu government increase its activity in Gaza, increase its prosecution and persecution of the Gazan people. My question to the Foreign Secretary is, if we have done so much and had no effect, if there is nothing left to do, what does he expect to change before the UN General Assembly meeting, and why should we not immediately recognise a Palestinian state?
Foreign Secretary.
Diplomacy is failing until it succeeds. So I'm not going to give in to the honourable gentleman's pessimism. And can I just say that in my conversations with Prime Minister Mustafa, after I had completed my statement at the UN, he walked up to me and gave me a warm embrace. We continue to work alongside the Palestinian Authority as we make these fine judgments.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the government's decision to trigger the snapback mechanism to address the Iranian regime's nuclear ambitions. Following arrests in May relating to a suspected Iranian-backed terror plot, my constituents in High Peak, and indeed three-quarters of Labour voters, want to see action on the terror threat posed by Tehran on the streets in the UK. Can the Foreign Secretary provide an update on the government's progress in prescribing the IRGC as a terrorist group?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to Honourable Friend for raising this question, and he will know that alongside the Home Secretary, we commission work from Sir John Hall on that specific issue of state threats, and we will be coming forward with further plans in the coming months.
Stephen Flynn.
The Foreign Secretary has just said that on the ground it is unimaginably bleak. Horrifying images and accounts will be seared into the minds of colleagues across this House. They are almost impossible to put into words, but we can and we must be precise with our language. I agree. It's a genocide, isn't it?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman joins many. I don't know if he's legally qualified, but I know that there are many lawyers that take that view. As he knows, we made an assessment based on a clear risk of a breach of international humanitarian law that meant that we did suspend arms sales that could be used in Gaza.
Tansing Desi.
Thank you very much, and happy birthday. Madam Deputy Speaker, Benjamin Netanyahu's blockade and weaponisation of starvation has plunged Gaza into famine. And that is why the UN Secretary-General has described this man-made catastrophe as a failure of humanity. And while children die of hunger, unfortunately, we have a situation whereby the Israeli government continues to deny the existence of starvation in the very territory that it seeks to occupy. Now, before the summer recess, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, informed the House about additional aid for Gaza. Can he inform us just how much of that aid has actually got into Gaza and what other further urgent steps is the government taking to bring this inhumane treatment of the population of the Palestinians to an end?
Well, can I reassure my honourable friend that the good news is that the aid that we have supported is getting in. Now, principally that has been around medical supplies, and there are medical supplies that are replacing the dire situation that exists in Gaza. But it's also the case that we've been able to work with the World Food Programme, and the World Food Programme appear to be the UN agency that is having most effect at delivering aid on the ground. They're not sufficient, but it is having some effect. I will be in the region in the coming days discussing these issues in further detail.
Kit Malthouse.
Madam Deputy Speaker, another, I'm afraid, profoundly disappointing statement from the Foreign Secretary, devoid of anything that is likely to bring a swift end to this conflict. While at home, the police have been arresting vicars and grannies, and the government's been hiring American spy planes to fly over Gaza. As he himself said, the Israelis have intensified that campaign, their aggression and the slaughter of innocents in that awful conflict. And everything he said, all his condemnation has come to nothing. In every statement I've been in this chamber that he's spoken at, he's stressed the importance of international humanitarian law. So my question today is why he's been so passive in defending the International Criminal Court in the face of another wave of American sanctions. What steps is he going to take to support that institution and the individuals that staff it in the face of these sanctions? And what discussions has he had with the American government to get them to reverse them?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, it's just wrong to say that this government has been passive in relation to the ICC. We fund the ICC. We continue to support the ICC. I think I raised the ICC in my second meeting with Secretary of State Rubio. We work very closely with our Dutch colleagues, particularly on the ICC. We've been crystal clear on the importance of international humanitarian law. I'm afraid he's wrong on that issue.
Melanie Ward.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Foreign Secretary will be aware that increasing numbers of human rights experts and genocide scholars assess that Israel's actions in Gaza equate to a genocide, with famine deliberately created and hospitals bombed to kill journalists. Against this backdrop, the government is right to recognise the state of Palestine and to do so in a way which tries to drive change on the ground. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary, does he share my deep concern at the unacceptable new restrictions on visas and registration set to shut down the work of the most effective international humanitarian organisations in Gaza, and what action is the government taking to try to prevent this?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is right. It is unacceptable restricting the ability of aid workers to go about their work in the face of suffering. Can I put alongside her another issue that I'm hugely concerned about, which is effectively starving the Palestinian Authority of the funds also to pay its staff and complete the reforms that we're trying to work with it on, such that it can never get to a position where it can apply the governance that I know that it wishes and hopes to.
Sir Oliver Dowden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I despair at many aspects of the conduct of the Netanyahu government and the suffering of Gazan civilians. However, I do have grave reservations about the timing of this unilateral recognition of the state of Palestine, because I fear it will allow Hamas to claim that the vile massacres of the 7th of October have somehow succeeded. This is a concern shared by many of my constituents. What reassurance can the Foreign Secretary give about the choice of timing and the signal that that sends?
Secretary.
Well, can I be crystal clear to the right honourable gentleman? Hamas is a terrorist prescribed organisation. There can be no future for them in Israel. When we do the work that I outlined on a framework for peace and on the day after in the region, part of that is how we disarm in Gaza, and part of that is how I suspect those to the left of Hamas exit Gaza, its leadership, and find a third place to be. So there can be no role for Hamas. But given what has been said about the E1 developments, let us also remember what is happening on the West Bank, the settler violence, those who seem totally opposed to two states. And what we sought to do is try and effect change on the ground as we make that assessment. And can I disagree with them? It's not unilateral. Canada, Australia, the French, we are acting together combined to try and bring about maximum leverage to bring about change on the ground.
Paul Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the government's intention to declare a state of Palestine formally at the UN later this month, something many of us on the Labour benches have been pushing for ever since we were elected, and something that was in our manifesto. It's the biggest shift in British foreign policy in decades, and is a major step forward to giving the Palestinian people the hope that they will have the state that they've long been denied. But while I welcome the sanctions on Iran today, with the famine now formally declared in Gaza, and with 132,000 children expected to suffer from an acute malnutrition between now and next June, can you tell me if the UK is actively looking at fresh sanctions on Israel to prevent that further tragedy?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I can't comment on sanctions from the dispatch box, but can I know that my honourable friend has campaigned long in his constituency and before on the issue of recognition, and so I'm grateful for his statements in relation to that, and I recognise that the situation I outlined, the situation that I was updated from by Tom Fletcher this morning, is grim, it's dire, it's horrendous, and that's why we have to work collectively with other partners. I'll be back in the region to see what more we can do.
Tim Farron.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This should not really be difficult. We can, as I do, passionately support Israel's right to exist securely and in peace. We must call for the immediate release of the hostages without any strings attached, demand the exclusion of Hamas from the post-conflict settlement, and at the same time, we must say, without a shred of equivocation, the shooting and starving of innocent civilians in Gaza is nothing other than utterly and totally, fundamentally evil. There can be no other word for it. So why has this government still failed to sanction Netanyahu and his entire cabinet?
Secretary.
Well, I hear the strength of passion from the right honourable gentleman, but let me say to him that I would urge him to look closely at our sanctions policy, and he will struggle to find any other government in the developed Western world. We've had 3 packages of sanctions just in the last year, and 2 on government. France, I don't think, have yet sanctioned government ministers, so we have done a considerable amount.
Can I please urge colleagues to keep their questions short? And for the Foreign Secretary, I know this is a very sensitive subject, but keep his answers on point. Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank my honourable friend for his statement today. Israel's decision to further escalate operations in Gaza and expand further into Gaza City, where famine has officially been declared, shows that Israel simply is not listening to our concerns. And given that the government has raised concerns over and over again, suspended free trade, suspended some arms licences, it almost says to me that Israel is kind of mocking our government. So I just wondered, is it time to take further measures and ensure that we fulfil the UK's obligations as a third state under international law? Because we could be at risk here.
Well, can I reassure my honourable friend that we're not at risk, we're not complicit. I'm a former lawyer, I study these things closely, and I would ask her to look closely at what we have done in relation to other governments. We don't act unilaterally, but I think that we're holding up pretty well. I wish the situation on the ground had changed. It has not yet changed, but we will continue to do everything we can to bring this war to an end.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and happy birthday. The law of armed conflict is hardwired into the behaviour of our military, and we should demand the same of our friends and our allies. Israel is our friend and our ally. Therefore, what assurances has he had from his colleagues in the Ministry of Defence that they have gained from the Israeli interlocutors the assurances I think we need that the 40 or 50 incidents in the West Bank and in Gaza that have involved the IDF since 2023 will be brought to a proper conclusion and any wrongdoing is held to account?
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that he put his remarks very well in his opening statement, and I would accord with them. We need proper independent scrutiny of some of this behaviour. We called for it, by the way, in relation to the awful atrocity on the World Central Kitchen staff, British nationals who lost their lives, and we await the Advocate General. I understand that there is going to be an investigation, the Israelis have said, into the incidents that we saw last week, but there are many where it's not clear that there will be. So he's absolutely right to put this centre stage, and of course it's something that I do when I speak to the Israeli government.
Ewan Yang.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I strongly welcome the Foreign Secretary's historic move to recognise the State of Palestine and thank him for all the work he has done to progress this issue. While we follow the news from Gaza, let us remember the journalists who risked their lives to bring us the news. My constituent, who's the former managing director of Al Jazeera English, is now mourning the deaths of 6 of his former colleagues in a targeted attack. And I too am waiting for news from my former Financial Times
colleague who is still stuck in Gaza, and he is starving and he is at risk. So will the Foreign Secretary meet with me and other media stakeholders to discuss how we can work together to progress evacuations and support our journalists on the ground?
Well, can I say I'm very grateful, because journalists and media workers play an essential role in putting the spotlight on the devastating reality of war. We're part of the Media Freedom Coalition, and the UK, of course, is urging Israel to allow immediate independent foreign media access and afford protection to journalists. I'm very happy to meet with her.
Ellie Chance.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Israeli government is clearly hell-bent on their horrific plan of eradicating Palestine, with a continuing, ever-worsening genocide in Gaza, and now approval of the shocking E1 plan that will divide the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So how can the government continue to take no further action when there are so many options open to them? How many times have we heard the Foreign Secretary say in this chamber that if things do not improve, if Israel does not desist, he will take further action, and yet he has not? When will this government take action, end UK complicity, take action to end the horror in Palestine?
Can I just say to the Honourable Lady, we banned arms sales that could be used in Israel back in September. Germany did it just a few weeks ago. We have had 3 rounds of sanctions against Israeli settlers and some of the expansion that we're seeing. France are yet to do the same. I ask her also to look at the amount of money that this Parliament, this government has agreed to in terms of aid, particular for medical supplies. She says there's more, but she doesn't quite articulate what more she believes we can do. All of us want to bring this war to an end. All of us want to bring through this, but it's becoming a bit too easy to assert not recognising the work that we are leading globally.
Andrew Pakes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement? Can I start on a positive point, which is that to thank the Foreign Secretary and the Parliamentary Under Secretary for the work they've done securing an agreement where we can get students and young people out of Gaza to continue their studies. So many of our debates make us feel powerless. We've demonstrated on one part of this jigsaw at least some power to change people's lives and getting them here to study, and I thank him. If that is the best of humanity, this summer's also seen the worst of humanity, with the forced starvation of hostages and of civilians waiting to get food at the food stations where it is. One of the concerns that I get raised often by constituents of mine is that will there be a Palestine and a West Bank and a Gaza left to recognise? Can you reassure us this government will strain every muscle to bring the international community together so we don't just recognise a state of Palestine, we start a process that delivers it on the ground?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for his question and the way that he's standing up for the people of Peterborough. And let me just be absolutely clear. We have supported the departure of over 500 individuals from Gaza since the beginning of the conflict. He's heard the Home Secretary set out the more that we're doing on UK medical evacuation of children, and there's more to follow in the coming weeks on achieving scholars, but also on further scholarship students in receipt of full scholarships, because we want to support those young people. They are the future of Gaza, and absolutely we will do everything we can to defend that two-state solution, to defend a concept that goes back a long way, and to recognise the responsibility that we have as the UK because of the Balfour Declaration and our obligations to both sides of this ancient conflict.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Like the Secretary of State, I've supported a two-state solution for very many years. But there is a slight contradiction when he says that immediate recognition, or almost immediate recognition, would not be rewarding Hamas because Hamas would be disarmed and a new state would be demilitarized. Is he saying that the recognition will not go ahead unless and until Hamas is disarmed? If the recognition is going to go ahead before Hamas is disarmed, shouldn't it be confined to those parts of Palestine that are currently represented by the Palestine Authority?
Well, can I just remind the right honourable gentleman of the letter that President Abbas wrote to Macron, where he was clear for the first time that there can be no role for Hamas, and he will recognise that we will make that assessment on recognition in the coming weeks. But clearly the E1 settlement has moved the dial even further away from where we were a few weeks ago, and that recognition is a process.
Thank you,
Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Foreign Secretary said that diplomacy fails until it succeeds. And we have been in this House often talking about the tragedy unfolding. As we approach the second anniversary, could he explain to the House, as he goes to the UN to discuss and agree the recognition of a Palestinian state, what threshold would need to be reached for a UN peacekeeping force to ensure safe passage of food and welfare to those people who are starving and will be dying even as we stand here today?
Well, she will understand that the Israeli government has set itself against some of the UN agencies that would need to uphold that, and so I think that that feels unlikely in the conversations that we've had. But I do applaud the work of Cindy McCabe and the World Food Programme for the work that they have been able to do to get essential food to people that need it.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary chose his words very carefully about arms supplies that could be used in Gaza. Could he be a bit clearer with the House on this? Are we still supplying parts for F-35 jets that are used to bombard people in Gaza? Is the overflying of RAF planes from RAF Akrotiri over Gaza being shared, the information being shared with the Israeli military forces? And thirdly, is RAF Akrotiri being used as a staging point for the delivery of weapons to Israel in contravention of what he said about arms sales? Does he not realise that if we supply arms to a country that's complicit in war crimes, including genocide, we are also complicit in those war crimes?
Hear, hear. Well, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, who has considerable experience, that it is absolutely my job to make sure that we are not complicit, and that's why we are not selling arms that could be used in Gaza. That's why we're not selling direct F-35 kit to Israel. And in terms of those reconnaissance flights, I'm sure that he would agree that it has been right, certainly up to this point, to support hostage release, which is the only reason why we have offered support to find those hostages and get them home. And surely, I say to him, he would agree with that.
David Burton-Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement and the work he's doing on this very important matter. Over the summer, I received letters from Fossey, Joseph and Alice, 3 children from Eastwood Baptist Church, amongst many others, expressing their sadness at the situation in Gaza. They wanted me to give them my assurance that we are doing all we can as a government to bring an end to this horrendous conflict. So I ask him today on their behalf, can he give them and me that assurance, including him continuing to use all tools and sanctions at his disposal?
Well, the answer is very simply yes. And it is people of faiths, and I'm of Christian faith, like your Baptist constituents, but faith and no faith, are horrified by what they're seeing and want the United Kingdom to continue to do all it can to bring this horrifying war and suffering to an end, and that is what we do every day.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
I welcome the anticipated recognition of Palestine, which we expect later this month. Of itself, it will make no difference on the ground, but I think it's an important piece of symbolism. We've heard in response to earlier questions about the risks that journalists are facing, but we are aware that Israel block many journalists, including the BBC, from entering Gaza. What representations has the Foreign Secretary made to the Israelis about this?
Well, can I assure the Honourable Gentleman, I have made those representations to the Israeli government, and so has the Minister for the Middle East, who sits next to me. And I know that this is a topic of conversation amongst other foreign ministers across the developed world. We think that those international journalists play an important part of the landscape, an important part of the scrutiny of any democratic country. And Israel is a country that often reminds that it's a democratic country. It's important to let those journalists in.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've been talking about starvation in Gaza for the last 18 months. Now it's officially recognised as a famine. But I want to raise the starving of one man with the Foreign Secretary, and that man is Marwan Barghouti. Shortly after we announced the recognition, and then the Israeli government retaliated, in my view, with this E1 plan, Ben-Gvir entered his cell in an Israeli prison. He was very clearly being starved. It is time that Marwan Barghouti is freed by Israel, a man of peace, a man that can push forward the peace process. He's being starved. He's not being given access to his family. He's not being given access to the International Red Cross or his legal team. What more can we do to see his release and for him to get his human rights and not be harassed and threatened by Ben-Gvir, who we have sanctioned?
Well, I'm grateful, I'm sure the whole House is, for that update on his particular situation. I won't comment on the individual case, but can I just say that when I was making that assessment that was referred to previously, the IHL assessment on a clear risk, one of the areas I looked very closely where I did believe there was a clear risk was the treatment of prisoners. So I'm grateful for him reminding the House about those humanitarian concerns.
Alistair Carmichael.
Deputy Speaker, is the Foreign Secretary aware of the concerns expressed by his noble friend Lord Hayne around the possibility of contracts under the Army Collective Trading Service being awarded to the company Elbit Systems UK, whose parent company, Elbit Systems Limited, market their weapons as being, and I quote, battle-tested in Gaza and on the West Bank? Lord Hayne has written to the Defence Secretary awarding this contract worth an estimated £1.9 to £2.5 billion would entrench Elbit Systems at the core of UK's defence infrastructure for a full 15 years. To proceed with this contract would erode confidence in the integrity of our procurement system. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that Lord Hayne's comments should be given the fullest possible consideration, and that if they are shown to be of substance, then his friend, the Defence Secretary, should not be awarding contracts to a company like that?
Well, I want to reassure them no decisions have been made. This is an open procurement. No decisions will be made until 2026, and that whole House will have heard what he said.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think we all hear the frustration of the Foreign Secretary that he is leading in a way that other nations have not on this challenge, but it is that leadership role that we are looking to as a House. And I think we all also understand that individually nations have limited impact, but collectively is where the pressure can be brought to bear. So can he tell us, for example, what more he is doing with his colleagues in the world community to stand with the Israeli opposition to Netanyahu, the Israeli hostages, calling him out on his murderous behaviour? What more he is doing when he comes to this House and tells us that that famine is man-made? That is a war crime to report the Israeli government to the ICC. That we will recognise Palestine not as a threat, but as a statement of positive intent with our colleagues, and above all, to work with our colleagues in Europe, because the honest truth is not a single child who urgently needs medical assistance from Gaza has yet
come to the UK, but the European Union and World Health Organization programme is getting children out at pace and at speed. So what more could we be doing to work with them so those children could come in days? They've already been cleared by the Israeli officials. No, we must not judge ourselves by other countries. We must judge ourselves by whether we have truly done every single act we can, and there is more we could do.
For the Foreign Secretary response, lengthy questions are just denying other colleagues the opportunity to speak. Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I reassure her that we are working with our European counterparts, and what I get when I speak to Kaja Kallas and other European foreign ministers is the deep frustrations that she's heard me express in my answers. Can I remind her of the further 15 million that we're finding today, that I've announced today, to support humanitarian efforts, and particularly the supply of medicines in the area. And I believe that the decisions that I announced at the UN a few weeks ago are absolutely not unilateral. They are working with other partners as we make an assessment on the ground of the situation prior to UNGA.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can the Foreign Secretary confirm that in his discussions with his US counterparts, he specifically raised the issue of delivery of aid? The United States is a hugely important actor in that regard, has the potential to be positive in terms of improving the existing arrangements, but also has the potential to be a blocker. And his interaction with the US can make the difference in that regard.
Well, I recognise the experience that the Right Honourable Gentleman brings to the Chamber, and he will have heard the Prime Minister raise these issues with President Trump in Scotland, and can I reassure him that I raised these issues with the Vice President Vance in Kent. I got into a slight problem with a certain sort of fishing licence, but I raised these issues as well.
Rachel Hopkins, after which I'll be calling Steve Darling. Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement today and the reminder of the actions this government has taken already, including restoring funding to UNRWA, suspending arms exports that could be used in Gaza, suspending trade negotiations with the Israeli government, sanctions packages on violent settlers and far-right Israeli ministers. But we need to see further action with regard to humanitarian aid getting into Gaza, where we are seeing a man-made famine. But does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that the action could be taken immediately if the Israeli government allowed those UN trucks on the borders of Gaza entry?
Yes, I do, 100%.
Steve Darling.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The war in Gaza is horrific on a number of different levels. However, I'd like to particularly focus on one level, and that it is the deadliest conflict for journalists. Journalists who often act as our window into atrocities. Will the Secretary of State please explain why we are selling any arms to Israel?
Well, I'd ask the Honourable Gentleman to look in detail at export licences and how they work. So I've said that we are not sending arms to Israel, but he will recognise, for example, that if there is body armour that NGOs use on the ground or that journalists use on the ground in the West Bank, or indeed in Gaza, we are continuing to export that, and for the very reasons that he has said. I don't think he would want us to stop.
Conlon.
Deputy Speaker, I welcome the announcements the Minister has made today, and in particular on support to get critically ill children out of Gaza into the UK to receive specialist NHS treatment. On the two-state solution, though, can I ask the Minister, does he agree that the Israeli government's promises to carry out more illegal settlements in the West Bank will further undermine prospects for a two-state solution?
Well, the plans deliberately attempt to thwart a two-state solution. They split the land effectively. They drive out Bedouin and villages. They were opposed by the last government when these plans first surfaced, and they're opposed by all of the international community. Entirely unacceptable, and I repeated that to the Israeli Foreign Minister just a few days ago.
Dr. Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm deeply concerned by the misery, suffering and death that's happening in Gaza, and I thank the Foreign Secretary and the work he's doing with friends and allies in the region, which I think is a really key part to solving this problem. I also support a two-state solution, but is he not concerned that the ultimatum regarding unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state risks entirely disincentivising Hamas from negotiating any hostage release or ceasefire over the coming weeks and months?
Well, I'd urge the Honourable Gentleman just to keep up to date with the latest, and he will have seen that there have been announcements by Hamas on the terms for a ceasefire. We haven't yet got that ceasefire, and there remain disputes, for example, about the length of a ceasefire, about withdrawal of the IDF from parts of Gaza. But Hamas, notwithstanding the concerns that we all have, are in dialogue, particularly with our Egyptian and Qatari friends.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and happy birthday. I'd like to start my comments by welcoming the comments from the Foreign Secretary about the recognition of Palestine. Of course, that is absolutely what everyone on this side of the chamber stood for in our manifesto. I'd like to raise with him the specific issues around the devastation and starvation of people in Gaza and the numerous reports that IDF are targeting doctors. Can the Foreign Secretary tell the House of the UK efforts to evacuate people with family links to the UK, including the case of Dr. Roddy, which I have raised many times in this House and with ministers?
Well, can I say it was very humbling to meet with a group of doctors once more in New York who have served on the ground and to hear the hardships that they had experienced as very noble humanitarians. I think the Honourable Lady will see in the coming days UK efforts to evacuate people, particularly children, from Gaza. We do rely on Israeli permits, so it's not straightforward. It's not easy, but I'm grateful that she's put the issue of doctors front and centre this afternoon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This morning, the Scottish Labour leader told a press conference in Glasgow that, and I quote, "There is a genocide happening in Gaza. I believe that Benjamin Netanyahu is a war criminal and he will have to face further sanctions." Madam Deputy Speaker, does the Foreign Secretary agree?
Well, can I say that I've got a list of statements that have been made by Yair Lapid, the leader of the Democrats, Yair Golan, the Israeli Mossad director, Tamir Pardo, all of whom call into question much of what they're seeing on the ground, and some of them use phrases like ethnic cleansing. So, of course, I'm aware of what is being said. In the end, we need a ceasefire. We need to bring this horror show to an end.
Clive Efford.
I've known my right honourable friend for more than 25 years, and I know that if he was up here on these back benches, he'd be as angry and frustrated as we are. But it does get frustrating coming here, expressing our concerns. With all due respect, he wrings his hands and says we're doing all we can. We go away, nothing moves on. So what can my right honourable friend say to us today to say that there is hope of something changing in the near future? Because in the meantime, it's the hostages and the people in Gaza who pay the heaviest price.
Well, I'm very grateful to my dear friend for what he has said, and he knows that this is extremely frustrating. I spoke to Envoy Steve Witkoff in the last 24 hours to be updated on the situation in terms of a ceasefire and the gaps that still exist between the two sides. There are still gaps, unfortunately. He knows that this will only come to an end with a ceasefire, so we continue to do everything we can. I do sense that this month is an important month as we head towards UNGA, So let us see where we get to. It's the UN Assembly coming together is a big moment, and I'm sure the Israelis and Hamas recognise that.
John.
Madam Deputy Speaker, many happy returns. The Druze in Syria are suffering nothing short of atrocities. That continues. What practical help can the UK give as the Israelis try to set up safe zones for them and also humanitarian corridors?
My honourable friend, the Minister for the Middle East, was there last week in Syria discussing these very same issues, and of course we've made representations to the Israelis about our concerns that some of their activity is undermining the prospects of the new government.
Andy MacDonald.
Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for making it clear that this country has its historic responsibilities in the region, and he's been consistent in calling for a ceasefire month after month. That hasn't happened. So I just ask him in all sincerity, what changes does he really expect by simply continuing to repeat that? And if Israel has agency and has the ability to qualify through those unless statements whether recognition is granted, I ask him to reflect upon that, and in answer to the earlier exchange around the potential for a peacekeeping force, surely it should not be that Israel has the ability to put a block on that. The people of Palestine deserve better than that, surely.
Well, can I be very clear to my honourable friend that Israel does not have a veto on our decision to recognise, and I hear what has been said about a peacekeeping force, but when I discussed these issues with the Secretary General at the UN a few weeks ago, there are real tensions that Israel has put in the way with their ability to work with the UN, and that's why I think it's doubtful that that will come to pass in the near time.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Back in May, I raised concerns about exemptions for licences for components that were going out to Israel, and I wrote to you and passed that on to the Department of Business and Trade. To date, I've had absolutely no reply, so I have absolutely no idea whether those licences have been suspended and those are not being used. My residents are worried that while the licences are now for non-military items, the exemptions for licences may be used for things that could harm Palestinians. Can I ask the Minister to please do all that he can to work with his colleagues in the Department of Business to make sure that we can get that reassurance? Yeah.
Absolutely, I'll take that up.
Sonia Kamal? Not in the chamber. Rupa Hawke?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is truly momentous that this government this month looks set to put long-standing UK policy into practice and recognise Palestine. But it does feel that time is running out for a two-state solution, as he acknowledged. And also, now that we've witnessed man-made famine, the bombing of hospitals and hostages, and the denigration of the UN, I think the PLO delegation is banned from the General Assembly. All international norms, as we know. Would he agree with my constituents that on trade, sanctions and settlements, it is time to step up a gear in this ever-worsening situation and put the full force of action behind his very strong statements?
Secretary.
I disagree with that last part, so I simply refer the Honourable Lady to what I've said. She will struggle to find another government in the developed Western world that's done more on sanctions than we have. Even our neighbours in France have not done as much as us, and the European Union have not done as much as us on this issue. And I think our record on humanitarian aid is considerable, and she's heard what's been said about the issue of recognition.
Claire Young.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I know that the hundreds of constituents who contacted me calling for action to end the heartbreaking suffering in Gaza will welcome the Foreign Secretary's recommitment to recognising Palestine. However, if, as he says, recognition is rooted in the principle of a two-state solution, why is granting it being used as a tool to change Israel's course, rather than taking other actions such as sanctioning Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Well, I make no apology for trying to affect behaviour on the ground as we head to the UN General Assembly meeting and to give diplomacy the chance. It still has an opportunity to work, and that is why we did it.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I start by welcoming the announcement of the additional aid and medical care for Gaza that has been announced by the Secretary of State today. It's now widely reported that the Israeli government is considering the annexation of the West Bank as a direct result of the United Kingdom's plan to recognise the Palestinian statehood. So will the Secretary of State make it absolutely clear that that move would constitute a blatant breach of international law? And further, will he assure the House that the government will not hesitate to take the strongest possible action, diplomatically and politically, to condemn any such unlawful annexation?
It would be a breach of international humanitarian law, and so we will keep working with our partners to try and ensure that it doesn't come about.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary asks what more this government can do to ensure the genocide in Gaza is ended. Might I suggest that the doctrine of responsibility to protect is enacted by the United Nations, and any and all means possible are exhausted to demand an end to genocide? Intervene to defend the helpless. Intervene to help the trapped and starved civilians of Gaza, half of which, if I may remind the House, is made up of children. Act now, immediately.
I think I agree with everything that the honourable gentleman has said, and that is what we are attempting to do.
Warinder Jus.
Mr. Speaker, instead of taking substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza, agree to an immediate ceasefire and long-term sustainable peace, the Israeli government has ignored us. They've failed to let aid go through and created a man-made famine. It appears to me that the only people that the Israeli government will listen to is Donald Trump and the United States. So can the Foreign Secretary please confirm what discussions he has had with Donald Trump to take action against the Israeli government?
As I've said, that I have spoken to Secretary of State Rubio, Envoy Steve Witkoff and Vice President Vance about these issues. I leave discussions with the President of the United States to our great Prime Minister.
Anne Davies.
Deputy Speaker, data from the Israeli military shows that 83% of people killed in Gaza since October 23 have been civilians. Killing at this mass scale for months on end is unparalleled in modern conflict. So will the Foreign Secretary act to place far more pressure on Israel to end the mass killing of civilians by suspending the UK's current trade agreement with Israel and sanctioning those responsible for breaching international law?
Well, over 63,000 people have now lost their lives, and well over 100,000 are injured as a result of this war. So she's right to put that front and centre, and she will recognise that we made a decision about suspending any negotiations for a new trade agreement a few weeks ago.
To Peter Prinsley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Professor Oz Salzberger describes a battle for the soul of Israel in the Financial Times of yesterday. There are thousands and thousands of moderate voices in Israel crying out for an end to this terrible war. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis march for peace. What can our government do to support these people?
Well, I'm hugely grateful to the honourable gentleman for bringing to mind the many Israelis marching, the many Israelis expressing deep concern for the plight of the hostages. And I certainly have both Israeli and Jewish friends hugely concerned about the direction that the Netanyahu government is taking this war and this further military operation into Gaza City, which will inevitably lead to more loss of life.
Martin Wrigley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The United Nations described the famine in Gaza as a deliberate collapse of the systems needed for human survival, a man-made disaster, a moral indictment and a failure of humanity itself. Every day my constituents ask me, what more would it take for the government to recognise this as genocide? What would the Foreign Secretary have me say to them?
Well, I'd refer to the remarks that I've made before at this dispatch box. I recognise what is being said. I recognise the work of international scholars particularly, and the fine judgments that must be made by the ICC and the ICJ. But we have an important democratic principle that these decisions must be made by lawyers, and it's for governments to act in the way that I have set out today.
Debbie Abrahams.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his statement today, but also for the extensive work that he and his team and his officials have done to secure the international coalition of allies in the recognition of the state of Palestine, although this has been very much undermined by the Israeli cabinet and what they are proposing around the E1 annexation plan. Is there more that we can do to extend this coalition and increase the level of sanctions to stop the Israeli behaviour like this? And is it appropriate also to transfer, as they did in 1988, the UNGA meeting from New York to Geneva so that the Palestinian delegation can attend?
Well, I do think we need further dialogue on the issue of Palestinian attendance at that meeting, and I do recognise that these decisions were made previously and held in Geneva, but I hope that we can have some reconsideration and that we can afford the delegation the same privileges that they've had for many years.
Caroline Bowden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have a UN-declared man-made famine, children and babies being starved to death, journalists murdered, and now the world's leading genocide scholars state that Israel's actions meet the legal definition of genocide. It's clear that painstaking, careful international diplomacy is not working fast enough, and the Gazans are running out of time. So isn't it time for us now to lead our allies in actions that Israel might take notice of? Sweeping trade sanctions, sanctions on Netanyahu and his entire cabinet, and a commitment that we will recognise Gaza at the UN with no conditions.
Well, the whole House will have heard what she said, and she will have heard what I've said on a previous situation, and I'd ask her to look closely at what this government has been doing, our leadership globally relative to other near partners. And I think the decision that we made a few weeks ago and the provisions that we set for how we would recognise and the judgments that we'll make as we head to UNGA are particularly important.
Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Foreign Secretary very much for the action that's been taken by him and his colleagues to enable the safe passage of scholars to the UK, a number of whom hope to come to Glasgow University. And I'm also very grateful for the work being done to evacuate critically injured children. The Foreign Secretary has enumerated the number of children who have already died of famine, 119, with 132,000 under 5-year-olds also at risk of starvation in the next year. But we've already seen 17,000 children killed as a result of the conflict, and I refuse to call it a war because it isn't a war. There is one side that has arms and another side that does not have an equality of arms. But the Foreign Secretary has previously said that he would never rule out anything that could be helpful in this regard. And I understand why he will not commit to further sanctions at the dispatch box. But can he assure the House that he has not ruled out further sanctions or any other actions that might be helpful, both in the run-up to the UN meeting and beyond?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for what she's saying in relation to children, and also state that, of course, not just the children who have died as a result of famine, which is horrific, but the many, many thousands of children who are malnourished. And anyone who knows anything about education and children is if you are malnourished children, then you are affecting outcomes for them as they get older and move towards adulthood. And that's why this is so horrific and so disastrous for the consequences of peace and the outcomes that we want to see. I've heard what she said about sanctions.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary said that we can and must be precise with our language. I stand here 23 months after the atrocities of October the 7th, completely unforgivable atrocities against civilians and other innocent people, and I join in his call for all hostages to be released. However, since the 8th of October 2024, Israel has been extremely precise in its language about what it was going to do in response to October the 7th. Their playbook of war crime, genocide, murder, starvation, water blockages, power cuts, bombing hospitals and schools was laid out in extreme detail for all of us to see. Nobody on this planet can say we did not know. And over the 23 months, there has been nothing that this government has done that has prevented Israel from enacting its line-by-line extermination plan. It doesn't want two states between Palestine and Israel. It actually doesn't care about the lives of the remaining hostages. So what will this government do to help Israel see sense and save lives, both the hostages and the Palestinians?
I do think it's important, notwithstanding the strength of feeling of the Honourable Gentleman, that he recognise when he says Israel, that Israel is a complex place of many opinions, and he will have found disputes, I think, certainly from the government, but I think many people in this chamber, on the direction of travel that the Netanyahu government has set themselves and the extremists that exist in that government that have taken them on a certain path. And I do think that's an important qualification. And we are doing all that we can, but he will recognise that we do that with partners seeking to exert leverage, and that's why we've made the decisions that we have most recently.
John Slinger.
Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree that now more than ever the will of the international community must take precedence over the will of those who perpetuate conflict and deny a two-state solution? Of course that means Hamas, but also, sadly, this Israeli government. Can he assure me that the government is looking at previous conflicts where the international community, with Britain at the forefront, did, despite difficulties, end conflicts and build a fair and just peace, overcoming facts on the ground and restoring hope?
Well, no conflict is the same, and this is a region that obviously has had numerous conflicts over the year. What we've seen over the last 23 months has been horrific, and it's my job as the country's chief diplomat to do everything I can to stretch every sinew to try and bring this to an end, working with colleagues, and to keep my language diplomatic.
Andrew George.
Madam Deputy Speaker,